Welcome back to The Explainer. So, today we're unpacking a truly mind-bending sociological shift, one that fundamentally challenges pretty much everything we assume about human relationships. We constantly hear debates around the globe about how to save plummeting birth rates or how to modernize dating. But while the rest of the world has been caught up in those endless debates, France has quietly and profoundly executed a total downgrade of traditional marriage. Actually, when we look at this through a strict sociological and legal lens, you could make a really strong argument that marriage, as an independent, highly distinct legal species, has practically gone extinct within the French Republic. It's an absolutely massive transformation. What we're seeing is this incredible battle between the heavyweight of traditional legal contracts and the unstoppable rise of absolute individual autonomy. And I got to admit, seeing the data and the history behind how a foundational pillar of human society has essentially been rewritten overnight, it's just astounding. We're going to map out exactly how this happened, step by step. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The statistical paradox, a dying institution. To really wrap our heads around the magnitude of this shift, we have to start with a statistical paradox that perfectly frames just how rare this institution has actually become. Think about the sheer shock value of this comparison. On one hand, we have the average mortality rate for catching a common cold, which hovers right around 0.03%. And on the other hand, we have the current marriage rate in France sitting at roughly 0.3%. Now, sure, looking at the absolute numbers, the probability of getting married is technically 10 times higher than the probability of passing away from a passing sniffle. But sociologically speaking, that is incredibly dark and frankly, morbidly fascinating. It's the ultimate statistical irony. We're talking about what has historically been the foundational stepping stone of adult life, and its rate is currently hovering in a bracket that's uncomfortably close to a statistical anomaly. When you're comparing the likelihood of a societal cornerstone to the likelihood of a rare medical outcome, you know for sure that the underlying social fabric has fundamentally warped. Because think about it, when the most vital cellular unit of a society plunges to a rate that aligns with low probability events, its entire function in society changes. It fundamentally loses its job as a universal foundation for the masses. Historically, marriage was the default infrastructure, right? You grew up, you got a job, you got married, you had kids. It was the assumed path. But in France, marriage has transitioned from being that unavoidable societal cornerstone to essentially becoming a boutique for the minority. It is no longer the mandatory framework for building a life. It's a highly niche, optional lifestyle choice. It's almost like taking up pottery or deciding to collect vintage cars. Think about what this means for the everyday person building a life right now. If marriage is no longer the default path that organizes society, what replaces that foundational security? What happens to a culture when its most basic building block is retired to the archives? Well, to understand exactly why this happened, we have to look really closely at the legal mechanics operating behind the scenes. Moving right along to Section 2, stripping obligations and deconstructing contracts. So, recently a move by the French Parliament sent absolute shockwaves through the global legal community. The law now explicitly rules that women do not bear sexual obligations within a marriage. Now, looking at this objectively, we have two profound impacts happening at the exact same time. From the logic of progressive human rights, this is an undeniable triumph. It's the absolute pinnacle of legal evolution, elevating absolute bodily autonomy to the highest possible level above any institutional demand. But from the perspective of pure social contract theory, this acts as a swift legal decapitation of the traditional marriage structure. For thousands of years across almost every civilization, the core thread holding the legal concept of marriage together, the thing that made it distinctly different from just living with a roommate, was the lawful binding of intimacy and reproduction to secure lineage and property. By explicitly removing sexual obligation from the legal framework, that historical defining link is formally severed. It completely changes the definition of marriage as an institution designed for family building. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly stark tension between the past and the present. Historically, we had this traditional contract, legally bound by intimacy, reproduction, and strict exclusivity. It was a highly specialized agreement. But in the modern French framework, we see the complete triumph of absolute bodily autonomy. And because of that, the unique defining characteristics of marriage just begin to evaporate. If a marriage contract no longer contains exclusive statutory requirements for reproduction and intimacy, the line between a sacred lifelong vow and a generic standard business partnership agreement dissolves entirely. It functionally becomes an administrative convenience, which inevitably begs a massive question. If the legal definitions of this ancient institution are changing so drastically, essentially gutting it from the inside out, why in the world isn't there massive cultural pushback in the streets of France? That takes us to Section 3, cultural roots, or the French walking marriage. The answer to that lack of pushback is that France isn't just suddenly embracing a minimalist view of relationships out of nowhere. There's a deep, powerful historical inertia at play here. Consider this perspective from sociological analysis. Marriage is often seen as an anchor of social status or asset restructuring. That phrase right there, asset restructuring, is the key to everything. In the French context, marriage was historically viewed as a highly pragmatic merger. We're talking about two noble houses aligning or two bourgeois families pooling their land, wealth, and social capital. It was an economic and status-driven contract. And because of that highly practical nature, true passion, burning romance, and deep emotional reliance have historically hovered completely outside the walls of the marriage enclosure. This brings us to exactly why the French are uniquely immune to the legal deconstruction of marriage. It literally comes down to their cultural DNA. First, there's a deeply rooted tradition of mistress politics in modern French political history. And it isn't merely a series of scandals, it's practically woven into the fabric of the state, treated with a collective shrug by the public. Second, consider their incredibly rich literary traditions. For centuries, French literature, from courtly love to Madame Bovary, has consistently separated true, sweeping romance from the dry, suffocating legal confines of wedlock. Romance was often framed as an act of rebellion against marriage. Because of this historical walking marriage mentality, where love and legal partnership walked on two totally separate paths, the French never viewed marriage as a strict, mandatory container for finding your soulmate. Instead, it was always more of a cultural posture. So when the legal institution of marriage effectively dies or gets downgraded to a simple partnership agreement, it doesn't hurt the French public. It's easily digestible because it perfectly aligns with what they've secretly believed for centuries anyway. Which leads us to our final part, Section 4, the post-marriage era and individual awakening. You see, France isn't just an isolated, quirky cultural case, it's a pioneer experiment for the future of all human relationships. Now, if you walk through Paris today, you're obviously still going to see beautiful white wedding dresses and elaborate photo shoots outside Notre Dame. The aesthetic of romance is very much alive and well. But underneath that surface aesthetic, society is actively rewriting its bottom layer code. Think of it like a computer's operating system. The underlying societal programming of what a marriage actually is has been completely deleted and replaced with a new OS based entirely on absolute autonomy. It's authentically fascinating to consider how a society continues to function day in and day out when its foundational source code for family building has been entirely swapped out for a blank document of individual will. To really synthesize this monumental shift, we can break it down into three core takeaways. First, the institution has been completely stripped of its historical, mandatory reproduction and sexual duties. Second, because those mandatory binding elements are gone, marriage has transformed from a rigid societal contract into a pure, voluntary legal statement of self-expression. You don't do it because society needs you to. You do it because you personally feel like expressing your bond. And third, this pioneer experiment ushers in a brand new era of completely fragmented family contracts. And this matters immensely, not just for France, but globally. This is a preview of where global individual autonomy is leading us all. We're moving away from one-size-fits-all societal obligations and entering an age where family structures are highly bespoke, decentralized, and based entirely on individual will at any given moment. So, what does this all mean? That brings us to a massive, looming question that I want to leave you with today. Think about your own life and the structures around you. If marriage is no longer the bedrock social contract, if it's become purely a boutique choice about individual self-expression rather than a societal necessity, what will be the next foundational unit of society? How will you and the next generation structure human connection when the default blueprint is just gone? It's a captivating sociological puzzle, and it's one we're definitely going to keep our eyes on as the data continues to roll in. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the deeply rooted structures around you.